Yes, like Huda, I would like also to thank the ERF as well as the Arab Fund for supporting this initiative, and also our distinguished colleagues from within the ERF and outside the region who contributed with us, to put together this volume, which has been a background for a very interesting discussion at the Arab Fund, where we presented the main findings of this research and also invited some major contributors to this literature, like Paul Collier and Alan Gelb, who actually also contributed to the conference. And that, I think, was a very valuable contribution to the debate on these issues, and the participants who were there, I think, were very excited about the discussion itself, because the issue of oil and natural resource case and whether the case is real or not, and how to avoid the case and so on is still, of course, an open question. But at least systematically analyzing these old age kind of development challenges, especially for our region, is a very relevant, policy relevant and interesting research topic as well. So the effort is capped by the editing of the book, which was published by Cambridge University Press. And we hope that the book will actually, we are not getting royalties, obviously, but we hope that actually the impact of the book will be substantial as we go forward. Basically, I think in the literature, in terms of the first question that identified by the book and Huda talked about, is there an oil curse in general, especially in the Arab world? The literature, the early strand of the literature has focused on the economistic factors, such as that economies that experience an overvalued exchange rate or an extended episodes of overvalued exchange rate, excessive domestic consumption, or high indebtedness are likely to experience. These are economies that are dependent on natural resources, oil and minerals, are likely to experience a curse where over time there will be an absolute decline in the economy, in the output. However, the more recent and is widely believed to be the more relevant development in this literature is that the curse is conditional, and not conditional on economic mismanagement. It is conditional on political and economic institutions. But then the economic factors are the channels through which the curse operate. So first of all, for the curse to happen, there has to be a major failure in terms of the economic and political institutions. And then this actually creates situations where either overvalued exchange rate or substantial overconsumption or highly indebtedness will become the channels through which the curse operate. And one of the chapters in the book actually undertake this issue by looking at the results, the benchmark results that can be generated from a large econometric studies, panel growth regression that accounts for the standard growth controls, but then pay particular attention to dissect the political institutions into an electoral standard of democracy. The famous measure is called polity, which measures the standard of democracy and competitiveness of the political process. And then another now very popular measure, which is the index of checks and balances, checks of within the government institution by judiciary and the legislative branch on the discretion of the executive branch. And it turns out that actually the results suggest that indeed we confirmed the earlier results in the literature that economic factors are conduit, but only under conditions of bad governance. But then within that, we found that actually high democracy is important, but is not really robustly important only when it is coupled with checks and balances. And that actually, in some cases, when you have a stable autocracy with checks and balances, can actually be more effective than a partial and especially factional democracy. So the most takeaway from this literature, important takeaway from this literature, is that checks and balances are very important regardless of the political system. And I think that perhaps explain the diversity of the outcomes of the use of the natural resource in the Arab world, for example, or in the region in general, that some regimes that are stable and has some measure of norms that can actually be perceived as historical legitimacy and historical, not formal but informal checks and balances might actually be much more effective in promoting development in general and particularly growth over time.
Ibrahim, you have 4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. We'll try my best. So this is an example where actually if you just rely on the standard of democracy, you can see that on the vertical axis we have the marginal effect of resource on GDP, and here we have the kernel of the density on polity, which basically the point here, I don't have much time to explain this, shows that democracy alone has to be a very well-established democracy, such as the one that can be found in the advanced industrial democracies in Europe and North America. But democracy in the developing countries that do not really have checks and balances would not necessarily do the trick. So this is really the main finding from here. The other key message is that fiscal institutions matter too. That actually, if we take the case of Chile, for example, where fiscal rules are very rigorously enforced, and that the Ministry of Finance in Chile does not have a discretion to use the sovereign wealth fund of the copper outside the planned projections that has already been agreed to within the government and through an independent fiscal committee, has actually, in conjunction with the very capable monetary policy and especially flexible exchange rate regime and so on, these have actually helped the management of the shocks in the copper economy as compared to many other countries, including oil-dependent economies in our region. So fiscal institutions in particular are also quite important. Economic diversification is an outcome of the strengths of the macroeconomy, and of course the other factors related to sectoral policies aimed at promoting productivity and so on. And we found actually for the cases of services, for example, that actually diversification in the service economy is becoming increasingly an issue that very much resembles the traditional tradable commodities. So services is becoming increasingly tradable. So then the issue of the competitiveness of the exchange rate and the stability of the fiscal regime and all of these are becoming also very important. But the point is that all these are important but conditional on good political governance.
1 minute.
Okay, I'm almost there. Services, okay. Yes. We looked also at the export concentration, and we found that actually export concentration is a rule rather than the exception in resource-dependent economies, except for certain situations where the fiscal institutions, the monetary policy are strong enough actually to support, to prevent the economies from being generating a structure of incentives that actually taxes tradable activities and reinforces the dependence on the resource base of the economy. Examples, for example, of highly concentrated economies would be economies like Sudan and Algeria, for example, the UAE being, for example, an example of a diversified economy, and simply because of the presence of Dubai as a major contributor to the diversity of the economy there. The case of Kuwait, for example, is very interesting because Kuwait is much more diverse in terms of the investment, allocation of investment, but not necessarily in terms of domestic production. In terms of the oil, rents, and labor market, let me very quickly say that the GCC economies, because they have very substantial rent per capita, they actually chose to actually extend the rents or to share the rents with the population in terms of providing jobs in the public sector. While actually in the populous oil economy, the outcome is not that pleasant, in the sense that actually massive unemployment happens, especially during the adverse shocks that affected these economies, because most of these economies decided to concentrate the rents or the returns from the oil on a certain subset of the society that are important for the survival of the regimes. That's why we see the outcome in the populous oil economy to be actually much worse, or at least not as pleasant in terms of the indicators of welfare and infrastructure development and so on. Nonetheless, however, the dependence on the public sector for creation of jobs in the GCC economies can be construed as an example of an oil case of sorts, but is not as severe as in the case of the populous oil economies. But still,
Dr.
it's a challenge.
Ibrahim,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, just one last slide. Conclusion. Oil is a blessing for Arab countries, an opportunity for development and prosperity. That's the first message. Yet, their performance can be so much better. Second message. Third, the curse is more related to bad political governance with economic manifestations rather than oil wells, which have hindered economic reforms and foster oil dependency. Finally, declining oil price presents an opportunity for many reforms for more sustainable development. Thank you.